Good afternoon. We're here to present Saudi Arabia and U.S. military aid. This is a Diplomacy Lab research project for the State Department at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. My name is Veronica Pacheco.
I'm Danielle Evans.
I'm Samantha Pena.
I'm Zola Campbell.
So let's start with the general background of Saudi Arabia.
So Saudi Arabia is located in the Middle East. Its major religion is Islam, which is broken into Sunni and Shia are the minority. The monarchy is based on the 1992 Basic Law and the Sunni Islamic law. Its major resources are oil and natural gas. Its major imports are machinery and other equipment. Its major exports are petroleum and petroleum-based products.
I'm going to be talking about the case study, which is the conflict with Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Beginning in March 2015, Saudi Arabia led a military coalition in Yemen, bombing areas controlled or contested by Houthi forces. More than 10,000 civilians have been killed and injured. Estimates of 2.9 million people have been displaced, and over 1.1 million people became refugees. Almost 21 million people are facing famine and are in need of humanitarian aid. Saudi Arabia faced growing economic problems due to the cost of its continued military intervention in the armed conflict in Yemen. The U.S. contributes to this crisis by providing aid, bombs, and other weapons to Saudi Arabia. These statistics have come from the Council on Foreign Relations in 2017. I will be providing information on human rights concerns between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. According to the United Nations Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, more than 2 years of relentless conflict in Yemen has devastated the lives of many civilians. Also, the Saudi Arabian government has harassed, arrested, and prosecuted critics, political and women rights activists, and members of the Shia minority. And they were all human rights defenders that were imprisoned under vague charges. Security officials continue to torture and mistreat detainees with impunity, and authorities continue to impose and administer corporal punishment that violate the prohibition of torture and other ill treatment. An estimated 17 million people are facing food insecurity, and if the blockade in Yemen were to continue, it is stated that it will be the largest famine the world has seen for several decades.
United States and Saudi Arabia relations. Saudi exports to the U.S. in 2016 were worth more than $16.9 billion, whereas U.S. exports to Saudi Arabia were worth more than $18 billion. This means that the U.S. is purchasing less from Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia is becoming more dependent on U.S. sales. Despite serious and effective efforts to counter the funding of terrorism originating within the kingdom, some individuals and entities in Saudi Arabia continue to serve as sources of financial support for Sunni-based extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Nusra Front. The 2002 report of the Congressional Inquiry after the terrorist attack of September 11 of 2001 stated that brought attention that alleged role of Saudi Arabia in supporting the terrorist attack of 9/11. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia relation to the United States, its interest, and its future trajectory are subjects of continuing congressional interest. In particular, Saudi leadership transitions such as the lower global oil prices, the related Saudi budget process and reform plans, aggressive terrorist threats from Saudi Arabia, and more assertive Saudi foreign policy, Saudi-Iranian tensions have fueled recent congressional discussions. Some in Congress expressed concern about U.S. weapons used in Saudi Arabia and how human rights violations are occurring and if they are with U.S. weapons and U.S. military trainees.
Now I will be focusing on IMET, which is the International Military Education and Training, which is the primary program that the U.S. government provides with grant funding for a variety of education and training programs for foreign military personnel. It provides training and education without charge, but in exchange, it would need reports on human rights efforts from the participating countries. Also, in the 1990s, Congress shifted IMET's focus to a new program called Expanded IMET, which focuses on the inclusion of foreign civilian officials, including democratic values and human rights.
Like my colleague mentioned, a series of agreements and statements by successive U.S. administrations for arms sales and military training arrangements, also military deployments, have demonstrated a strong U.S. security commitment to Saudi monarchy ever since the 1940s. Saudi officials were privately critical of the congressional prohibitions, as already mentioned, and appeared to prefer to avoid contentious public debate of U.S. foreign assistance to Saudi Arabia. The U.S. proposed arms sales to Saudi Arabia include combat tanks, pistols, Patriot missiles, helicopters, Chinook helicopters, and the THAAD missile system.
Saudi Arabia is susceptible to increased risk of terrorism due to geographical location and threats from terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Therefore, they need the U.S. security assistance in order to protect their country. We have 2 points of leverage. One is weapons and the other is energy. A decrease in U.S. weaponry sales to Saudi Arabia will reduce human rights violations in Yemen. Also, implementation of more sustainable methods of energy production reduces U.S. reliance on Saudi Arabia oil exports. If the U.S. finds better ways of creating energy, then we will not need oil from Saudi Arabia as much.
Okay, so we will be answering some of the questions that the State Department provided, and the answers will come straight from our research on Saudi Arabia and U.S. military aid.
Conditioning military assistance on good governance promote better human rights outcomes?
Yes, this is possible. However, there are other players that promote human rights outcomes, such as IGOs, NGOs, federal organizations, and civil society. Some examples include Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations.
The United States government prevent mass atrocities by threatening to cut off assistance or freezing weapons sales?
Yes, this can be achieved through sanctioning, including lessening security assistance or freezing weapons sales to the kingdom. This will reduce mass atrocities committed with U.S.-provided weaponry. This is not to say that mass atrocities will end.
Under what conditions might U.S. security assistance be an effective lever to promote positive human rights outcomes?
Under the condition of making advancements to sever economic ties, bilateral agreements, which can impact economic standing and national security.
How do factors such as strategic importance and natural resource endowments impact the country's susceptibility to U.S. pressure over human rights reforms?
Since countries are reliant on revenue from natural resource trading, U.S. pressure over human rights reform could act as leverage to initiate improvements.
Furthermore, during the Obama administrations, just like previous administrations, engaged the Saudi government as a strategic partner to promote regional security and global economic stability, since Saudi Arabia is surrounded by countries like Yemen, Oman, Iraq, Iran, and Israel. In January 2017, President Trump and King Salman spoke via telephone and came to an agreement for reaffirming bilateral ties between the two countries. They came up with the conclusion that they wanted to add a new strategic partnership for the 21st century, which included interests of both countries by announcing a joint strategic vision. Previously, President Obama had proposed a budget of $45 billion of providing arms weapons to Saudi Arabia. However, after the telephone conversation between President Trump and King Salman, and after President Trump visited Saudi Arabia in 2017, Trump proposed that the package for budgets of military training and arms sales to Saudi Arabia increased to $110 billion. Let's conclude our presentation with the success and failures of the Yemen conflict, which is our case study with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia continues to establish itself, and I quote, as a leader in disrupting terrorist finance within the Gulf region by increasing supervision of its banking sector and stiffening penalties for financing terrorism. This is by Blanchard. However, this is a success, but however, one of the failures of this attempt is that Saudi Arabia is withholding international human rights standards and norms, and is also prohibiting peaceful protests by Saudi civilians. Failure to defeat Saudi-led Al-Qaeda affiliates based in Yemen continues to threaten Saudi's national security and incites civil unrests and jeopardizes governmental structure within the Yemen region. We have come to an end of our presentation. Thank you for your time.